Ashchos ik. Always having a muddy or dirty face is what it means.
George Fraser came to Ucluelet in 1894. He lived in Ucluelet for over 50 years and passed away in May of 1944. The story goes that as George was being carried out of his tiny cabin overlooking Ucluelet Inlet for the final time, he said to his friends, "I don't know where I'm going, but it doesn't matter. I've had my heaven here on earth."
My name is David McIntosh. My wife and I moved to the west coast of Vancouver Island over 50 years ago. When here, we bought a little house on Imperial Lane, and I began to do some gardening. It was basically, it's all about rhododendrons and heathers. George Fraser was born in Lossiemouth in northeast Scotland in 1854. He apprenticed as a gardener at Christie Nurseries, which is still in existence in Lossiemouth. He then went and worked on various estates in Scotland, and after he completed his apprenticeship, he devoted 4 more years of study in Edinburgh. In 1889, after several years of discussion, the City of Victoria hired John Blair to develop what's now Beacon Hill Park. He immediately hired George Fraser as his foreman, and George supervised the planting of many of the plants that you see around the park now. There is a plaque for George in the middle of Beacon Hill Park to recognize his work. And even more interesting, there are 3 rhododendrons near the old stone bridge, and those are still there after over a century. George came to Ucluelet in 1894. He bought 236 acres, which extend from one of the terrace beach right down to what's called Fraser Lane. And for 236 acres at the time, he paid $236. The original south gate to the garden was located between the 2 schools, Ucluelet Elementary and Ucluelet Secondary, and they've gone now, but there's now a memorial garden roughly in that same area across the street. Marion Crossley of the Ucluelet pioneer family Lee described George Fraser's garden. Many ornamental trees, plums, cherries, almonds, several varieties of oak and birch, as well as numerous less common deciduous ones grew in the garden. There was also a monkey puzzle, green and variegated hollies, a Japanese umbrella pine, a magnolia, and many varieties of evergreens. During the summer, the garden was a mass of annuals and biennials. Sweet peas climbed up the shed wall. There were great quantities of foxgloves, hollyhocks, brilliant patches of marigolds and zinnias, cosmos, geraniums, nasturtiums, lupins, delphiniums, ageratum, poppies, and fragrant lilies. In shady corners were beds of tuberous begonias. The town itself was very much what I call a stump ranch, And as people came and gradually changed it, it was still considered to be a fairly isolated area. Despite the fact that George was a lifelong bachelor, he enjoyed quite a social life here. He was involved in making sure there was a school here. He donated land for it, for students of Ucluelet. And he also liked to play a violin, which he had, and he played it at various gatherings. Besides rhododendrons, one of the things that George left behind was a pond that he created, and it's behind a house on Helen Road in Ucluelet. It's still there, it still holds water. He became what's called a hybridizer, and what he was doing was not only was he growing rhododendrons, he was taking different rhododendrons and combining them to make new rhododendrons, and so he made several of them. I'm trying to save some of George Fraser's rhododendrons, and just 3 of them here. This is the Fraser eye, and this is one of the ones that brought him to the attention of people. He also did a George Fraser rhododendron. Somebody else probably named that for him. And also Fraser's pink. And he actually sent out some seeds that he'd developed, and he sent them out to Pennsylvania to his friend Joe Gable. And that was the one that became known as Mrs. Jamie Fraser. George had a half-brother who moved here, and George named a rhododendron for her, Mrs. Jamie Fraser. Another one that he became known for was John Blair, named after his boss at Beacon Hill Park when they were laying out the park. And it's a white one, and it looks like an azalea. Many people would call it an azalea, and it has actually a fragrance, which is not unknown amongst rhododendrons, but rather rare. George, being a good Scotsman, of course, was involved with heathers, particularly Kaluna heathers, and so he convinced the commander of the Air Force Base near Tofino to drop heather seeds everywhere. Nowadays, I guess he'd be called an eco-terrorist, but in those days, people did things like that. Despite his isolation, George was well known amongst other horticulturalists. He was highly respected, and he was awarded a medal by the Vancouver Island Horticultural Society in 1936. And even more importantly, he was awarded a posthumous gold medal for pioneers from the American Rhododendron Society. In the late 1990s, Bill Dale and 2 of his friends began a project studying Vancouver Island rhododendron hybridizers. And as Bill later told me, he said, "We started with George Fraser and never moved on." Bill became an advocate to protect the legacy of George Fraser. And he came to Ucluelet and persuaded the Ucluelet Lions Club, led by Dave Godfrey, to plant rhododendrons along the highway and a memorial garden between the 2 schools.
We had received a letter of request from Bill Dale, who was working with Dr. Stuart Holland and Francis Gundry at the time. I believe it was back in 1990s. Bill Dale had contacts with all the rhododendron societies on Vancouver Island, and there were 5 of them. And he reached out to them for possible donations of either financial donations or plants to get this project going. And that's how it came about that we started receiving many dozen plants, truckloads of plants, literally, delivered to Ucluelet. I remember unloading them in the works yard in the rain, mostly. Wanda McAvoy was also quite involved with the George Fraser project at the time. And I understand she took over as the chair, and with Dave McIntosh's involvement, and kind of kept things going for a number of years. I do understand through Wanda that it's been difficult to, again, continue the interest to the level of having a specific George Fraser event or George Fraser Day event in May each year. I don't know how many years now it's been since they've had any kind of a formal one, but I'm pleased to hear that there's some interest within the community now to revive that particular event.